October has arrived, and that means we are solidly in spooky season, one of my most favorite times of the year, if not my most favorite. And part of the reason why I love spooky season so much, especially in the last couple years, is that I've gotten really into reading horror, and October is the perfect time of year to read as much horror as I can possibly stuff into my brain. Some of my favorite books of the last couple years have been horror, especially literary horror, and the more of the horror genre and all the many subgenres included in it that I dive into, the more I appreciate it as a genre and honestly wish I had gotten into horror earlier. And in preparing for this video, I was looking at the horror that I had my eye on, that I'd been wanting to read, and as I started pulling them off the shelves, I realized I actually have a lot of horror unread sitting on my shelves. I do have to pick one to start with though to get the ball rolling. And honestly, I have been wanting to read Graveyard Shift by ML Rio for ages now. I have read If We Were Villains by the same author and loved it, gave it 5 stars. And this cover is fantastic, first of all. I know you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but how can you not? The cover is amazing. I was also very intrigued by the description, which is 5 night shift workers, an ancient cemetery, an open grave. Every night in the college's ancient cemetery, 5 people cross paths as they work the late shift. A bartender, a rideshare driver, a hotel receptionist, the unofficial steward of the derelict church that looms over them, and the editor-in-chief of the college paper, always in search of a story. One dark October evening in the defunct churchyard, they find a hole that wasn't there before, a fresh open grave where no grave should be. But who dug it and for whom? Very exciting, very up my alley. It's super short, coming in at 125 pages, so a really quick, easy read to get the ball rolling, get us started. I'm gonna go start the Graveyard Shift, and I'll be back when I have thoughts to share. Cross your fingers and toes for me that some of these books are not only gonna freak me out, but also gonna be new 5-star favorites. Finished 4 horror novels. Hello? That's Chewy. He's trying to add to the spooky vibe by opening my very squeaky office door. Anyway, I finished 4 horror novels already, so I'm going to review those for you. I meant to pop back here every time I finished one, but it's been kind of a whirlwind of a month. I'm not going to lie. Anyways, we're here. I have books to review. Let's do it. Starting with The Staircase in the Woods by Chuck Wendig. I was really looking forward to this one, mostly because I think woods are creepy. I think they are so full of potential for horror for so many reasons. I also love horror novels that just inexplicably introduce architecture in places it shouldn't be, or architecture that feels wrong somehow, or is alive or something. I just find it incredibly creepy and fun. And one of my favorite horror novels is House at the Bottom of the Lake by Josh Malerman. So I was kind of hoping that the idea of a staircase in the woods would be, you know, a similar vibe. Unfortunately, I didn't like this book. I didn't like it at all. The more time that has passed since I finished it, the less I like it, and I didn't like it when I was reading it and when I first finished it. And the basic premise is that there's a group of friends, and as teenagers, they are partying, they're drunk, and they spot a staircase in the middle of the woods, as you might expect. And one of the friends decides to climb the stairs, and when he gets to the top, he disappears, and he's just gone forever. Everyone eventually accepts he must be dead, including his family. The friends kind of split up and move on. And then many years later, they're reunited, and probably, possibly, maybe have the opportunity to discover what might be at the end of random staircases in the woods. I just didn't think it was good. I didn't think it was good. This is a book about the power of friendship, which, you know, adults need friendship too. It just felt very juvenile, the way that the message was portrayed. The characters themselves felt very juvenile, and it was very cheesy, very over the top, and not in a fun way. I didn't like any of these characters, and I don't have to like characters to enjoy a book, but these ones were just so insufferable on so many levels. And we were meant to be really invested in their friendship, as you might expect, but we were given almost no time to bond with them when they were actually friends. We spend almost the entire time with them in the modern day, when most of them have not spent any time together, don't stay in touch, aren't friends anymore. And I just couldn't find it within myself to care, not only because I didn't care about any of the characters individually, but because, like I said, we were given no time to connect to them or understand their relationships when they were still together. We got a few flashback scenes and that was it. I was very tempted to DNF early on because I just got a feeling that it wasn't going to be for me based on how clumsily, bluntly it was handling its themes and how sort of one-dimensional, stilted, and awkward the character development was and the dialogue. But I was intrigued by this idea of a random staircase in the woods that someone might climb up and then disappear forever. That is creepy and cool, and I wanted to know where the staircase goes. So I kept reading, and when we got to the end, I found the answer deeply unsatisfying and honestly kind of insulting. After suffering through this entire book, which is basically just trauma porn. It handles most, if not all, of the difficult subject matter in a really insensitive way, in my opinion. It's very graphic and gory. There is so much trauma of so many kinds. It's just an onslaught, nonstop. Which, I mean, it's horror, so that's not necessarily something that I'm not prepared for, but it felt like it was without a purpose other than to shock you and to gross you out over and over again. It felt deeply insensitive, like I said, to the various topics that it was exploiting for this horror shock value. And it was all for no reason. Most of it was completely pointless and disconnected from the stairs in the woods, from these friends, from their missing friend. And then the ending just hits you over the head. Zero subtlety. You need friends. You can't do it alone. Value your friends. Check in on your friends. It felt very much like YA messaging and YA characters and dialogue sort of shoehorned into adult horror so that it could be as graphic and shocking as possible, which was just a really incongruous, discordant combination that I did not enjoy. All the characters sucked. The ending pissed me off. I just had a terrible time, okay? I'm giving this 1 star. I'll do a brief spoiler section in case you've read this so I can clarify a bit more of why I hated the ending so much. But yeah, I would not recommend this. I don't think it was worth it. I didn't find the reveals worth slogging through this book. It's not a particularly short book either. Just no. If you want to read a book about architecture existing in a place where it shouldn't, read House at the Bottom of the Lake by Josh Malerman. It's significantly better. Very weird. Not going to say it's not weird, but much better. So I'm going to do a brief spoiler section on this one before I move on. I don't want to talk about it for too long. Don't want to waste my energy. Spoilers for Staircase in the Woods. This is for the entire book. Spoilers. Skip this if you want to read this book. I don't know why you would, but maybe your taste is very different from mine, and that's okay. Okay, we discover not too long into the book, I guess, after some boring, unnecessary backstory on these characters that I did not care about at all, we get to the top of the stairs. We discover that at the top of the stairs is a creepy house with dead people in it. And every time they go into a door, they're in a different room. It's constantly shifting and changing. And in every room, there has been some sort of violent death, often other types of trauma and abuse and horribleness. It's usually described in great detail. And it's just like a hall of horrors. Every single room is just more trauma, pain, suffering, and they wander in this house for a while. They get split up. They find each other again. They reveal things to each other, including the fact that their friend that brought them all together in the first place, because he said he was dying from cancer and wanted to see them one more time, doesn't have cancer, and actually already knew the staircase was here and actually had already explored it and wanted to lure them into it because he was mad at them for giving up on their friend who disappeared all these years ago. There are reveals about their relationships as kids and things that happened to them as kids, including very traumatic stuff. And eventually they get to the core of this weird house of horrors and realize that it originated with a vet from World War II, I believe, who ended up murdering his whole family. And that birthed this house somehow. There is no greater meaning or reason for us to experience any of these many traumas. The only one that might make sense is the one that's revealed about Nick's backstory, but even that didn't feel particularly emotionally resonant because Nick was not developed enough as a character, in my opinion, nor was his relationship to the other characters developed enough. They discover there's also this like supernatural entity that's running the house, that's in charge of the house, that does a villain monologue. We also get a villain monologue from Nick when he reveals that he lured them there. And then they finally get out of the house. They beat it with the power of friendship, then track down their friend because they realize he might still be alive. When they track him down, also with the power of friendship, they learn that he might be a serial killer now because he spent a lot of time in one of these horror houses and might have totally lost touch with reality and been deeply traumatized, as one might expect, being exposed to all of this trauma for so long and being trapped there because a bunch of young women, I believe, are going missing in the environs of where he's living now. And weirdly, the implication seems to be at the end that they don't mind so much if he's a serial killer because, you know, trauma's rough, but he's their friend, so they should be there for him, even if he is a serial killer, which is a weird message. Honestly, the author's note at the end was way more heartfelt and felt way more genuine and interesting to me than the entire book, and it makes me feel bad about hating the book so much, but I just hate this book. I thought it was terrible. I did not have a good time with it. I'm very annoyed that I wasted my time on it. I should have DNF'd. I can't help myself though. I get so curious. I want to know the answer. I should have just looked up spoilers of the ending. Hindsight is 2020. I just thought this was very poorly done. The dialogue is so clunky. The characters are all so insufferable. We don't care about them. We don't care about their relationships. The house is just graphic, gory, shock value, trauma, exploitation. Ugh. It's the corner of the horror genre that I try to not ever go to. And I was not under the impression that that's what this book was. And again, very incongruous with the like cheesy friendship is magic message at the end. Just what is happening with this book? Anyway, that's it for spoilers. How blunt can you be? I don't know. I hated this. 1 star. Would not recommend. The next horror book I finished in October I liked a lot better, which was We Used to Live Here. This is by a Canadian author, and at first I thought it was set in Canada, but no. One in a long line of Canadian authors setting their books in the US, I guess for more mass appeal, because the US has 10 times the population of Canada. But it makes me sad every time when I get excited for a Canadian author and then realize that they didn't bother to make their story a Canadian story. That's not really a major critique, it's just a thing that I am pointing out. So this one I liked a lot better. I found this one deeply engrossing, could not put it down. We have this couple who have bought an old crumbling, maybe not crumbling, an old big house that needs some work, and they're planning on fixing it up, flipping it, and selling it, essentially. And our protagonist is Eve, and the setup is that she's home alone and her wife is off at Home Depot or something. I don't remember. Her wife is doing errands or something, not at home, and the doorbell rings and she goes to answer it, and there's a family there, and they say, hey, we used to live here. Could we look around? And she wants to say no, but she ends up letting them in, and then they won't leave. So really creepy setup. As a homeowner who works from home and is home by myself a lot during the day, this freaks me out. If someone came by because they used to live here and wanting to look around, I would be so uncomfortable. I would not want to let them in, so I could relate to Eve so much. And the idea of these strangers in your space and then they just won't go away is so uncomfortable. But of course, things escalate from there. Of course they do. Like I said, really engaging, really engrossing, super fast paced. I think what's great about this one is that it really plays on the uncertainties, the fear, the terror of your own perception of your life and of your own personal safe space being invaded. So your home being invaded by strangers, but also not being able to trust your own perception and what's real and what isn't, your own memory, the people around you, your own experiences. And that's what Eve is going through in this book. And it's just so well done. It's very intense and anxiety inducing. And I really enjoyed it for that. I do think, however, that the author tried to do not even one too many things, but like 15 too many things in this book. And that's my one main critique. He just was throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. And a lot of the things stuck and were great and very creepy and interesting, and I liked them. But a number of those things were just so superfluous and added extra confusion for no reason. It felt like there were several interesting, creepy stories in this one book. And because so much was happening, we couldn't really focus enough on the main story. And some of those side quests never got resolved. There were loose threads. There were aspects of it that were just less engaging to me because there was so much going on. And I just tried to filter those things out and mostly ignore them because a lot of them never came back anyway. But I was a bit frustrated by how messy this got at times. And it seems like this has already been optioned for a movie, and I can see how it would work well as a movie, but of course we know as book lovers, when they get adapted, books tend to be simplified quite a bit, and I think this book would definitely benefit from being just simplified to fewer plot lines because it was just a lot. I did still really enjoy it. I had a really fun time with it. It was a very easy, fast read. It was scary and intense, and there were lots of vivid moments that I could really see in my mind's eye. I can think of so many of them right now off the top of my head. It was really well done. Just too much going on. It was really lacking focus, I would say. I'll do a quick spoiler section to kind of point out some of the things that I liked about it and some of the things that I felt were just unnecessarily shoehorned in there. But honestly, I kid you not, there's just so much in this, including hidden messages and Morse code and random capitalized letters that you have to put together and mixed media stuff and websites you could go to. Like, there's a lot, okay? I couldn't even cover all of it if I tried. I mean, I could. I'm not going to. It would make this video so long. It's too much going on, okay? And I do kind of feel like the author, in a good way, wanted to pay homage to some of his favorite horror novels, horror authors, horror movies, and just tried to do it all in one. It's still a really fun read despite that, which is impressive, honestly, but you kind of have to filter things out as you go, or I felt like I had to because it was just a lot, a little chaotic. I think this would be significantly more fun to read as a group with your friends or in a book club or something, and then just spend hours and hours picking things apart and theorizing and comparing things and researching things and deep diving and bouncing ideas off each other. I think it is probably significantly less fun to do it the way I did, which is just read it by myself. But I think the vast majority of people do read as a bit of a solitary activity, so take that how you will. I do think where this book shines is when it focuses on very human fears based in our DNA, our evolutionary need for connection and community and belonging, and twisting that to make you feel isolated and alone and unsafe in the relationships and places where you should feel safest. Most of the rest of the peripheral stuff that was tossed in there was just noise to the core of what made this a really scary and intriguing story, which was really character driven for Eve specifically. So I'm probably sitting around 4 stars. I think probably 3.5 rounded up just because I enjoyed it so much while I was reading it, but it is a bit messy and chaotic. So just keep that in mind if you end up picking it up, unless that's really your thing, in which case, have fun, enjoy theorizing and breaking everything down and researching every tiny thing and putting the codes together and looking up the extra websites and looking for clues. So spoilers for We Used to Live Here starting now. I'll give you a couple moments to skip ahead, use the chapters or whatever while I drink a sip of tea because I'm still getting over a cold and my voice is struggling. And yes, this is a TARDIS mug, which is appropriate for these spoilers because the few extra aspects thrown in there that I really loved about this were the multiple dimensions, different timelines, potentially time loops aspect, which sort of connects to Doctor Who, and the time travel of it all, the wibbly wobbliness of time. I really liked that aspect. I think that that was great, and I think that was great as an explanation for what was actually happening, instead of it just being Eve losing touch with reality, it being a mental illness story, which was sort of the justification or the rationalization in the end for other people around her, was that she must have lost her mind, she must have a mental illness and has to be put in a mental health facility for her own protection and for the protection of other people. Whereas the real explanation is that the house she was living in is not a normal house and has portals in a variety of areas to other parallel houses in parallel universes in different points in time, and everything is weirdly looping and connected, and people who are ahead or behind in the timeline and all that confusion, and that she is slowly losing touch with reality because her reality is shifting all around her at all times, and people who she's known her whole life suddenly are acting like they've never met her, and people are calling her by different names, acting like she's not married to her wife, and it's slowly chipping away at her own understanding of the world, gaslighting on a major scale. I thought that was really interesting. But like I said, there was just so much else thrown in there. I feel like the secret messages about gods always watching were kind of random and unnecessary. All of the subtle and very not so subtle references to Satan. The family name of the people who show up on her front step at the beginning of the book is Faust. Her name is Eve. There's stained glass of an apple. There's lots of imagery. And I don't know why Satan or the devil or biblical imagery had to be part of this at all. Religion was kind of a piece of characterization for some of the characters, but not really explored in any depth, so I'm not sure why that was necessary to include in all the imagery, except maybe to throw you off the trail, like red herrings, but it was just superfluous, again, in my opinion. The doppelganger stuff was kind of odd. You know, we get a scene where it seems like her wife has been replaced by a wrong version of her wife who has nefarious intent, and she has to get away from the wrong version of her wife to find the real version of her wife. I prefer the idea that these different versions of these characters who don't seem to know what's going on or have a different understanding or have a tattoo or don't or call someone by a different name or whatever are alternate versions of them from different realities, not necessarily nefarious or malignant, but just a different version of the person who has a different understanding of the world because they're from a different reality. I think the idea of them being sort of replaced by supernatural beings or demons or something, which seemed to be implied at times, was just, again, superfluous to me. I'm not sure why that needed to be there. We also get some documents throughout that explain a lot, occasionally leaning into info dumping. And there's one that breaks down all these different roles that people have in the house. And there are hosts and there are anchors and there are guides and there are tourists in the house. And there's all these rules about how these different roles get filled and sacrifice to replace this kind of role with another person. And not only did I feel like that was over-explaining while also kind of not explaining anything, we never got any answers for who fit into all these different categories. It made it feel more, I don't know, planned out by some sort of omnipotent being, whether a god or a demon. And again, that never really was explained, that never really came to fruition, and I'm not sure what that added. I think the idea of this just being a weird anomaly that naturally popped up in this place, there are overlapping timelines and it's just a weak area of existence where you can slip in and out. That to me would be scarier than the idea of Satan's playhouse being this random house on a hill. And he just loves tossing people in and giving people different roles to play and pushing them around like it's their dollhouse. I don't know. For me, that's not as scary. And again, it was never really taken anywhere. It felt like it was introduced to us as a possible explanation, and then the author moved on and threw a bunch more at us as he kept going. And I just thought, I don't need all of this, you know? Stick to a couple aspects and leave it there. It's scary enough, the idea of not only a family you don't know entering your house and then not leaving, and then eventually starting to act like they've always lived there and you're just their aunt who they're allowing to live there, but they're going to kick you out. And also your wife is not your wife and lives far away, and your dog is not your dog, it's their dog. Or even the aspects of her starting to not really know what's real and what her experience is and whether she's losing touch with reality. This sort of really deep fear of everyone you love forgetting you exist or not loving you anymore, or suddenly being totally isolated and alone and not having a place to belong and not having safety in your relationships. That is significantly scarier than the idea of a guide and a host and an anchor and a ritual to replace people. Even if it wasn't meant to be gods or demons or Satan or something, there's implications that some of these characters have been around for centuries. I don't know. There was enough there already. It was just a lot. I also liked that it was playing with the idea of the Mandela effect, but taking it to a much more personal and catastrophic degree for one particular person. Just very unsettling. I'm gonna stop talking about this. I've already been rambling. I feel like I said though, I still had a really fun time with this. I'm rounding up to 4 stars. I would definitely recommend. I just think the author got a little carried away with too many ideas. Next up, I finished Graveyard Shift by Emma Rio. I was so excited for this because I loved If We Were Villains. For me, this was a bit of a letdown. I don't know if you can tell. This might be the least number of tabs I've ever used in a book ever. And it is a novella. It's only, 108 pages, but that's 6 tabs. Basically nothing. I was never really drawn in. I think for how short it is, it has too many characters. I didn't feel like we were able to get to know any of them very well because there were too many people to focus on, and it was never really clear how well they knew each other and what their history really was. Kind of similar to Staircase in the Woods. The characters themselves, in this case, it wasn't that they were really unlikable necessarily, but we didn't get to know them well enough. I didn't really feel like I had a great handle on each of the individual characters. And like Staircase in the Woods, it's sort of based on this friendship dynamic of solving a mystery. But in this case, there was even less development of their friendship, in part because it was so short. I actually just saw that Chuck Wendig, the author of Staircase in the Woods, blurbed this book. So interesting. Again, nothing particularly wrong with it. I think it had a creepy, eerie vibe. I thought the writing style was nice enough. There were some genuinely really creepy moments. I thought the idea behind it was interesting. I'll talk about that in the spoiler section, a brief one. But I just feel like it didn't really go anywhere. It didn't take it to the level I expected. It didn't get as scary or as creepy or as weird as I expected. The characters weren't engaging enough for me to really be invested in them. Their relationships never really developed enough for me to care too much about what happened to them or what their connection was to each other. I think this honestly was not enough content for a novella. I think a short story of maybe 30 pages could have been really tight and punchy and creepy and weird, and then get in and out, and that's it. I think that would have been great. I think this went on too long. It just didn't have enough content to fill 100 pages, while also sort of squandering 100 pages and not giving us enough character development to really care. 3 stars. It was fine. Not terrible. Not great. Just exists. A little creepy. Good for this time of year, if you want a quick, spooky read that's not super high stakes or anything. Sure. Spoilers, though, for Graveyard Shift. Let me mention what I did like about it, which was sort of the reveal of what was happening. So spoilers starting now. Basically, it's revealed that a bunch of dead rats are being dumped into this hole, and as they examine further, they realize that there's this unethical study being done at the university on insomniacs, and they found this particular fungus that they've been trying to inject into rats and then into people that they thought would help insomniacs finally be able to sleep. And one of the cohort, one of this group of sort of acquaintances or friends that smoke in the cemetery together, Hannah, has been doing this study because she's a severe insomniac. And essentially, they're trying to cover it up. Not only were they testing on humans when they shouldn't have been, but also they realized that this actually didn't work. And eventually, instead of helping the rats sleep with no other side effects, the rats started becoming increasingly violent and aggressive and were attacking each other and killing each other. And they realized that also applied to their human subjects, as in the town there are increasing events of people who have always been very calm and not caused any trouble, suddenly becoming incredibly aggressive and attacking people, becoming very violent. So they're trying to hide everything, cover it up, and pretend like they didn't do anything wrong. And this group of acquaintances slash friends decides to try to take them down because one of them is a journalist at the university paper, the editor of the paper. And Hannah, who was in the study, realizes that she might die because of this and that it's affecting her too because she is given the responsibility to question the man, the assistant, the lab assistant who was dumping the dead rats, to sort of drive him off into the middle of nowhere and question him and get details without anyone else knowing that she had been a subject and already knew him and kind of had more information than they did. And she violently beats him and leaves him on the side of the road to potentially die. And she realizes that it's clearly affecting her too because she's become very violent, and that might mean that she's going to die soon because both for the rats and these increasing incidents, the people became incredibly violent, would attack people, and then suddenly drop dead. So Hannah realizes she's probably going to die, although we don't see that happen on the page, and they put together an article exposing the study, and that's the story. And I think it was interesting, this idea, they're using the same zombie fungus and this idea that it helps them sleep for a while, but then takes over the host and causes them to become violent and then kills them. You know, it's a creepy, interesting idea. I think fungi creep people out for good reason. They're kind of creepy. They're delicious, but creepy. And the idea of a zombie fungus or zombie parasite of some kind is very unsettling. So I can understand why it keeps inspiring people to write horror stories about it. And this one was interesting. But again, I think if it was a short story, if we focused on Hannah, introduced how she's been an insomniac for her whole life, how horrific that is for her, and then she sees the light at the end of the tunnel, she's been accepted into this study, she's finally sleeping for the first time ever and finding peace, and then she starts feeling more and more aggressive and angry. She lashes out, attacks the lab assistant. He admits that the rats they were testing on became violent and then suddenly died, and then she realizes what's coming, and maybe we end off before she finally dies, but we know that she's doomed. I think that could have been really effective. I just felt like there were too many characters and there were too many extra details that just didn't feel important to the story. They sort of diluted the horror and the atmosphere. Anyway, I think short story would have been amazing, very creepy. It was just too bloated, I guess, is my opinion. So that's it for spoilers. And those are my thoughts for The Graveyard Shift. Really interesting premise, creepy, atmospheric, liked the writing style. Too many characters, a little bloated, should have been a short story, 3 stars. Okay, the fourth and final book I'm going to review in this update is Nestlings by Nat Cassidy. We have a couple who have a new baby, and they have just won a lottery for affordable housing in a fancy building in New York. And they move in, excited to live in this fancy new building, and then they realize that things in this building are not quite as they seem. This was my first Nat Cassidy. I also have another one of his books, Mary, on my sort of short list of books I was thinking of reading for this video. I already have it borrowed from my library, so we'll see if I get to it. I thought this one was interesting. I'm really trying to think about what I can say because a lot of it might be considered spoilers. There were several aspects of this that were intriguing, creepy. There was really good tension. It was very engrossing and immersive and fast-paced and intense and scary at times. It was also kind of ridiculous and silly and very campy at times, which I kind of loved. I thought it was entertaining. I thought it was balanced well between genuine horror and really disturbing, unsettling moments and really graphic, gory moments, and then moments that were just kind of so over the top, you just have to laugh, you know? I also thought the characters were interesting. They're all kind of unlikable, but they feel very fleshed out and real. I hated one of the members of the couple with a burning passion. I'll reveal which one in the spoiler section for those of you who read it, but felt like a very realistic character, even though I despised them from the start. And I loved the sort of slow development of them starting off being sort of maybe a little off here and there, a couple little moments where you're like, that was kind of weird, or why would you say that or do that? And then slowly they become more and more obviously terrible until they're just full on villainous. I thought that was quite entertaining to watch. And the other character was not always super likable, definitely a very flawed, complex character struggling with their mental health, but was a really interesting character and interesting to follow. And I liked them even if I didn't always agree with their decisions or their choices. Through them, we were able to examine some really interesting ideas. I really liked the perspective of this story, examining the Jewish experience and tying Jewish folklore in with the horror element. I thought that was really interesting and has made me want to do a bit of a research rabbit hole into how Jewish folklore presents this particular horror element, because it's not a depiction of this that I have personally seen before, and it was really interesting. I also found it interesting how the story examined the difficulties of new parenthood and new motherhood. I think especially because, while I'm not a mother, some of the closest people in my life, one of my best friends in the world and my sister, who is my best friend in the world, had babies in the last year and a couple months, and I've seen them go through so many different emotions and struggle through so many things, not just with pregnancy and childbirth, but also with just parenthood and being a mother and having a child dependent on you at all times, and how many complicated feelings that can bring up. And I'm not sure how a mother would react to this book, or if I would even recommend a new mother to read this book based on the subject matter. Probably not. But I'd be curious, if you have read this book and you are a mother, how you felt about the depiction of motherhood, and specifically of being a mother with postpartum depression, which is what this book is examining with part of this couple. I always side-eye a little bit when a male author approaches writing a story like this, especially a male author who doesn't have kids. I can't say if the representation was good or not, but I did think the way it was examined was interesting to read as someone who isn't a parent and just is witnessing it sort of secondhand through people I'm very close to and love very much. This book also depicts someone who has been injured in childbirth to the point of needing a wheelchair, and her as an imperfect victim or imperfect disabled person who is not always accommodating and educating everyone around her and being really grateful for everyone's help and suggestions, that she's kind of mad at the world and her circumstances, and she's kind of pissed at everyone for infantilizing her and helping her too much, and acknowledging the struggle of trying to be a new parent while also being disabled. And this is, again, not an experience the author has himself, and I am not disabled and don't use a wheelchair, so I can't speak to the representation and whether it was well done or not, but I did think it was a really interesting perspective and added another layer of complexity to this character and to her experience, and it really was so integral to so many aspects of the story. So I'd be curious, again, if you've read this book and you are a wheelchair user, how you felt about that representation. It does seem like the author did a lot of research and talked to a lot of people and really made an attempt to depict the experience as honestly as possible. But again, I can't speak to whether it was well done or not because I don't have that experience. I really liked most of this, I would say. Like I said, found it really engaging, really silly and ridiculous and kind of funny at times, very gross and disturbing and unsettling and creepy at times, just kind of all over the place, but in a good way. But I will say that I found the ending infuriating to the point where I honestly didn't know how to rate this because I was so angry at how it ended. And I have looked up a couple reviews since to see if other people agreed. It seems like a lot of people really liked the ending, which, fair play. But also it seems like a lot of people disliked the ending for a completely different reason than I did, which is also interesting. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts if you've read this, what you thought of the ending. I'll get specific in the spoiler section, but the ending kind of soured it for me. It makes me feel very conflicted about the book as a whole. I still had fun with it. I zoomed through it. I read it so fast. I was really engaged with it. I found it really interesting. I'm very curious to read more of Nat Cassidy's work, but that ending was a weird choice. Aspects of it I liked, other aspects, no. For me personally. I think I'm landing at 4 stars just because I had such a fun time with it for most of the book, but that ending was rough. So we'll see if over time the ending weighs more heavily on my mind and I end up lowering my rating more. But for now, I think I'm sitting at 4 stars. So that's Nestlings. I tried very hard not to spoil anything, so hopefully I succeeded. I would recommend this. I think it was really fun and weird and gross and strange, and also examining some real issues in a variety of areas like the Jewish experience, anti-Semitism, disability, new parenthood, and those struggles, specifically motherhood as well, amongst other things, but those are kind of the major ideas being explored. I'm going to do a spoiler section, so don't watch this if you want to read the book, but let's chat spoilers of Nestlings by Nat Cassidy. So the horror element of this book is that there are vampires, but they're not traditional vampires. They're sort of insectoid vampires, parasitic vampires. They also kind of turn into gargoyles when they get old, which was one of the very campy elements of this. They're kind of skittering insects with long tubes instead of tongues that inject a poison into their prey to liquefy their guts and then they suck it up. It's even grosser in the book, I promise. It was kind of weird and cool, and I guess it's based on Hebrew vampires, the sort of Jewish folklore vampires, so I'm really interested to look into that more. I didn't know that Jewish folklore had its own vision of vampires. Very creepy and strange. There's one particular scene that I will never forget. I visualized it too clearly before I fully realized what was happening, and now I'll never be able to forget that image that I built in my brain. Damn my vivid imagination. Which I'm not going to describe for those of you who haven't read it so that I don't scar you as well, but if you have read it, when she goes back to the neighbor's house and sees what's happened to the parents and what their baby is doing, that image I will never forget. So gross. Anyways, so we have vampires. Basically, they're living in this building. Their queen bee vampire has sort of merged with the building. I envisioned her kind of like Cassandra from Doctor Who, yet again, just like a flap of skin and viscera stretched in this room in the basement. She is sort of their mother. She produces these little insects, little spiders. The building has this lottery system to bring lower income people in, always couples, or at least one parent, I guess, with a baby who is about to turn 1 year old, and they make sure the baby starts eating these little spiders and insects to slowly turn them into a vampire. Apparently they tried a bunch of different ages, but a baby about to turn 1 was the best likelihood of actually turning them into a vampire. Then the babies consume their parents as their first victims, I guess, and then are raised by the adult vampires because they can't reproduce any other way. I enjoyed the campiness a lot and was kind of shocked every time one of the really viscerally disgusting moments popped up because otherwise it felt almost lighthearted. I do think if you struggle with infants being harmed, this is going to be really hard for you. I typically really struggle with that, and kids being harmed in general. I think because this was so sort of surreal and campy, especially with how the babies were being affected, it didn't quite land the same way. For me, it didn't feel quite as doom and gloom and upsetting as more realistic harm. So take that how you will. But the ending, my God. Okay, so, I should also say Reed, the husband, is the one who I hated from the start. He was a douchebag from the beginning, but he just got worse and worse and worse. He was so self-centered. Why the fuck would he not just go to Home Depot? What is wrong with you? Your wife just gave birth and had such a severe injury from childbirth that she's now in a wheelchair, and she is the primary caregiver for your infant, and you won't go to fucking Home Depot to help her do her job from home, no matter how many times she asks you. Holy shit, dude, get your shit together. Anyway, so he was the worst. He eventually starts working for one of the vampires in the building as her personal assistant, and they sort of introduce him to what's happening and let him know that his baby has been turned into a vampire already and you can't undo it. But, if you join us, if you let us keep your baby, you could be special and you could stay here. And wouldn't that be nice? And he really wants to be special. So he's ready to give up his baby to these monsters, tries to force his wife to accept it as well. And she's like, what the fuck? No, what is wrong with you? But what I really hate about the ending is she doesn't believe him at first and then finally realizes that it's all true, and also realizes that her baby has been turned into a vampire and potentially can't be turned back, and also no longer recognizes her as her mother and views the vampires as her mother and wants to stay with them. And it turns into this sort of monologue about the real meaning of motherhood and how you have to sacrifice what you want for what's best for your child, which on the surface, sure, yeah. But in this book, that translates to Anna destroying the mother, Cassandra, viscera, curtain, vampire. This sounds ridiculous. And sort of taking down parts of the building so that they have to start over and leaving, but leaving her baby with them because she assumes her baby will be happier with her own kind. Also, she pushes herself down the stairs with Reed and he breaks his neck and becomes paralyzed, which felt like his just desserts, honestly, after so many of the things he did to his wife. That's sort of supposed to be this happy ending where she's finally fully accepted motherhood by giving her baby to the vampires and doing what's better for her baby instead of keeping her baby with her, and she doesn't get to see her baby grow up, and she's sacrificing her experience of motherhood to be a true mother by giving her baby her best life, which in this scenario feels ridiculous. And a lot of other people who hated this ending hated it because they were like, how could you leave your baby with monsters? What's wrong with you? Which, sure, yeah, that too. But my main concern is she's totally fine with this cycle starting all over again. at the very end, she goes to a new apartment building where her husband, who was paralyzed, has now been given the power to walk again by the vampires, but is basically a puppet for them and is a doorman at this building. And she believes her daughter has become the new queen, so a viscera curtain in the basement, presumably. What a life for your child. And she'll like pet the side of the building and feel like she can hear her daughter or something. But also, she notices that they have a sign that there are affordable apartments for rent, and presumably they're doing the same system where they're bringing in people who are trying to look for affordable housing with their infant children into a situation where they're going to turn the infants into monsters who are then going to consume their own parents or just die, because they also said at one point that a lot of the babies don't make it and don't make the transition and just die. So she's going to cause a bunch of other parents to go through the same horror and suffering, even worse than what she went through, more like what her neighbors went through, of being consumed by their own baby who's been turned into a monster over and over and over again to sustain her daughter who's now become a flesh curtain and all these other vampires. And that's supposed to be a happy ending? What? This is some like great statement of the meaning of motherhood. Weird. It's weird. Okay, I don't get it. I don't like the ending. It would be one thing if it wasn't framed as a great sacrifice of motherhood. If it was just like, well, shit, there was no other option and this is kind of terrible, but it is what it is. I guess I'm kind of glad my baby's not dead, but what a terrible life. But it's not framed like that at all. Or just like bring down the entire building on her and everyone else. Like you're sacrificing yourself as well, but saving your baby from a horrific life. I don't know. It was rough, y'all. I don't get that ending. Let me know your thoughts in the comments if you read it. What did you think? I just am baffled. I don't understand. The book was fun though. I liked the book. Just what was that ending? I don't know. The afterword was great. I'm curious to read more from Nat Cassidy. I'm a little cautious about yet another male author in the horror space who has a bit of an ambiguous name. I actually thought this was a female author before I started reading the book, and seemingly primarily writing female protagonists going through very specifically sort of women's experiences of like motherhood or menopause, I believe is what's going on in Mary. I'm not sure why a male author is the one to write those stories. And it's one thing if it's one author and they're doing their best and those are the stories they're drawn to for whatever reason. I'm not necessarily against that as a whole. And I do think that authors of all genders can write characters of all genders well if they're good writers and they are empathetic and they genuinely care to. I do think that there is a weird, troubling trend in horror of male authors, especially male authors, using ambiguous sounding pseudonyms, making a career off of poorly written female protagonists who they put through hell and trauma and sort of exploit female suffering for their own financial gain for a primarily female audience usually. There's just something I really don't like about that. And I don't know that Nat Cassidy belongs in that pool. I'm not saying that he does. I didn't feel like Anna was a poorly written character by any means. I also just didn't know necessarily how much authority Nat had to write this character, especially as someone who's not a parent. I mean, you can talk to people, you can research, authors can write experiences they haven't had. It's just a story that is so intrinsically linked to the experience of motherhood and postpartum depression, and it's really hard to separate it from that. And it's just a question. I'm just putting a pin in it. I'm just noticing it. I'm curious to read more from Nat Cassidy and see how I feel about his work on a more general scale instead of just one single book, and if I feel like he belongs in the category of authors that I no longer read, like Riley Sager, or if he's a male author who's just writing stories about women and trying to write them well, which is something I think is great. So we'll see. Let me know your thoughts if you've read more Nat Cassidy, but those are my thoughts on Nestlings. What a weird, strange, creepy, kind of funny, disturbing book with a really confusing ending. I think I'm sitting at 4 stars for now. I would recommend it, I think. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on the ending. But anyway, those are the first 4 horror books I finished in October, my first update. What a month this has been. It's getting more Halloween-y by the minute, which I love. Here, that means it's starting to snow, but I've kind of always associated Halloween with snow because that's the Canadian experience. But I'm very much losing my voice, so I'm gonna go. I've also been talking for an hour and a half. I'm sure I'll cut that down to be less than that because I'm sure I rambled a lot. But anyways, those are my thoughts. Yay, horror. Okay, so it's the night before Halloween. It's October 30th, and I have 2 more horror novels to review for you, bringing us to 6 total for this reading vlog so far. Let's start with Bat Eater and Other Names for Cora Zeng, though. Both of these I listened to the audiobook and read the ebook simultaneously on my Kobo, so immersive read, as I pretty much always try to do because it's my favorite way to read any book. And Bat Eater and Other Names for Cora Zeng was fantastic. I've had this book recommended to me so many times since it came out, and I think it's still a relatively new release. I'll have to look it up because I can't remember, but I've heard a lot of buzz about this book in multiple horror communities I'm in. I've had it recommended to me individually by many of you, so I really wanted to get to it this month, and I'm so glad I did because this was just fantastic. It was both devastating and deeply sad and lonely and heartbreaking and tender in some ways, and also absolutely terrifying and very creepy and very unsettling and gory and violent and shocking in moments. And it had larger messages that it was trying to tackle larger issues, specifically the rise in hate crimes and racism toward Asian people during the pandemic. And since the pandemic, I have not been the biggest fan of reading pandemic fiction or even just books that bring it up too often. I think I'm a little bit tired of hearing about the pandemic. I think a lot of people are. It just felt like it overtook our lives for so long. And it's often felt to me like it doesn't add much, but this book is specifically about the pandemic. It is intrinsically linked with the experience of living through the pandemic as an Asian American woman. Cora Zeng is half white, half Chinese, and she has experienced racism through her whole life. But as the pandemic begins and as it continues and escalates, she experiences escalating racism, both microaggressions and macroaggressions, but then also violence and hate crimes based on her Chinese heritage and being blamed, scapegoated by the government and by everyday people who are terrified and out of control and full of rage and taking it out on completely innocent people. And it's horrifying on so many levels. One of my favorite things about this is that it sort of has 2 pieces. It has the very grounded in reality experience of Asian Americans living through the pandemic and the fear not only of catching COVID-19 and potentially dying, but also the fear of being hate crimed and the rising abuse anytime they leave their house. So there's that piece of it. And that piece was very grounded, very realistic, and absolutely heartbreaking and devastating. Kylie Lee Baker did such a great job of making us feel connected even to some of these characters that we never meet alive on the page. And as much as it depicted the honest brutality and the goriness of some of those crimes and the sort of visceral quality was there, it also felt deeply respectful and thoughtful in its portrayal, and it made me just absolutely devastated, but also made me rage, and I think that's intentional. And then there's this other side of it that's leaning a little bit more into the supernatural, perhaps, without spoiling anything, and the supernatural side also had its own moments of tenderness and groundedness and quiet, lonely sadness and grief. And the 2 pieces were connected in various ways. But the supernatural side, while it was the more sort of classically horror piece of this novel, and the supernatural element gave me personally the most outright scares, it was also at times incredibly campy and sort of injected with humor, despite being very violent and gory and disgusting and horrifying. And that was a really interesting mix, and something that I think if someone described that to me, I would wonder how an author could balance that and do all those things in a single novel, but somehow Baker managed it. It was really well done, and I appreciated that while the novel is quite depressing, to be fully transparent and honest, and very sad, it also had moments of levity and humor, and I laughed way more times than I would have expected reading this. The characters are really lovable, and I felt deeply connected to not only our protagonist, Cora Zeng, but also the peripheral characters, and they all brought their vivacious sparkling personalities to the page in a way that I really appreciated, and that humor helped sort of break the tension, because there was so much tension both from the supernatural element but also this claustrophobia of being under constant surveillance by everyone on the street and everywhere you go, and the constant threat of violence from just everyday people. I just thought it was balanced so well. I thought the messaging was really well done. I thought Cora Zeng was a really interesting character. She's very flawed. She has a very complex relationship with her sister and has very, sometimes quite uncharitable thoughts and feelings about her sister. She's going through her own stuff. She also seems to have OCD. It's never named on the page, but those behaviors are there. And I also imagine that going through a pandemic with OCD, especially OCD of the type that Cora Zeng has, would be just so many orders of magnitude more horrifying. And the interesting other side of it is her reflecting on the fact that so many of her behaviors that were seen as strange before the pandemic, that made her out to be different from everyone else, are now just good practice during a pandemic of washing your hands as hard as you can, as many times a day as you can, and coming in and totally stripping and washing all your clothes in hot water and changing into something else and disinfecting everything, and just all these things that she used to do and be made fun of for or seen as signs that her brain was wrong or different are now just what the CDC is telling people to do. And I thought that was an interesting layer as well. I don't have OCD, so I can't say if the representation was well done, but it felt like it was respectful of her experience while also portraying it through a really raw lens, which is something that I would say of everything in this novel. I loved that the supernatural element was pulled from Chinese folklore, Chinese culture, Chinese religion, religious practices, and very much tied to Cora's father's side, her family, her aunt, the teachings that her aunt has been trying to share with her that she's sort of been resistant to until suddenly everything becomes very real for her. It was just fascinating and terrifying and very unsettling. I couldn't put it down. I couldn't stop reading until it was done. I was very invested in what was going to happen. The ending broke me into a million pieces. It was devastating. I mean, if I could rewrite it, I would change the ending because it makes me sad. But I think the ending making me as angry as it did is a sign that the book was really well done and that I felt very deeply for the characters and I was very invested. And it really drove home the message of the novel even harder, even though it made me mad and sad and devastated, and I was crying as I was finishing the novel. I just thought it was great. Does any of this make sense? I don't know. I really liked this book. I just thought it did so many things so well, and I would recommend it. I think if you're looking for a horror novel, this is a horror novel. It is scary and gross and creepy and eerie, and the tension is ridiculous, and there's shock value and sudden gore and so much happening, but also there is tenderness, there is heart, there is a larger message about the pandemic and rising hate crimes against Asian Americans, like I said, but then also more of a personal story for Cora about finding a place where she belongs, connecting to people, sort of spreading her wings, coming of age almost, even though she's in her mid to late 20s, I believe, finally stepping out from her sister's shadow and becoming her own person and finding her place to belong, finding her connection to her culture and embracing her Chinese heritage in a way that she hadn't done before, and becoming a badass, to be totally frank with you. And I felt a lot of feelings. I really liked this. I was very moved by it, and reading the author's note at the end made me cry all over again. And I just think you should read it, probably. I just think everyone should read it. It was so good. I will say that there is a devastating loss for Cora in the first or second chapter that is quite brutal, and that sets everything off. And also the fact that she is coming face to face with the rising hate crimes against Asian people, and often specifically Asian women in New York City, because she's working as part of a crime scene cleanup team. So she's seen firsthand how many more Asian women are being murdered versus other demographics as the pandemic continues. I think that's all I'm going to say, spoiler free, just because I really don't want to risk telling you something that's going to ruin your experience of this book. I really loved going into it with basically no knowledge of what I was going to get, either, like I said, because I didn't read this blurb or because I forgot it as soon as I read it. Sometimes having a terrible memory is very convenient. But I am going to talk about spoilers a bit because there's just so much in this book that I have been tiptoeing around that was great. So let's do that. Spoilers for Bat Eater and Other Names for Cora Zeng. Don't watch this if you're going to read this book, and I highly recommend you do. Go read the book, skip the spoiler section, use the chapters. You can come back and watch this later once you read the book. Okay, so basically, in the first chapter or second chapter, can't remember, but very close to the beginning, Cora is with her sister, Delilah, and they're in a train station, and a man grabs her sister and pushes her towards an oncoming train, and she loses her balance, doesn't fully fall in front of the train, but sort of falls forward, starts to fall forward, and the train beheads her, basically. And Cora watches that, and she is very close to her sister. They have a very deeply unhealthy and codependent and toxic and almost sort of obsessive kind of relationship. I think Cora later says that she never chose her white side, her Christian side of her family, or her Chinese side's religious beliefs because she had no space for other religion because her sister Delilah was her god, was her religion. And for her, it is absolutely devastating. I mean, for anyone to see something like that happen, even to a stranger, would be devastating, but to your sister, for Cora, the most important person in her life, absolutely traumatic and devastating. And she feels totally adrift after this because she has lived her whole life in Delilah's shadow, following behind her, doing what Delilah asks of her. And she doesn't know how to be. Who is Cora without Delilah? She doesn't know. And she starts working with this crime scene cleanup crew with Harvey and Ife, who are also both Chinese, and they notice an increasing number of young Asian women who are the victims of violent crime, that they are tasked with cleaning up these crime scenes, and they're noticing this trend and wondering why no one's talking about it. And they're also noticing that at these crime scenes for these young Asian women who have been brutally murdered, there are bats at the scene in their apartment somewhere. And as this is happening, the Hungry Ghost Festival is approaching, and her aunt on her Chinese side is trying to instruct her how to prepare for the Hungry Ghost Festival, and she's dismissive of it. And then she sees her sister as a ghost. And the descriptions of the ghosts, absolutely horrific and terrifying. They're extremely tall. They have these really long, really thin, I think they're described as like a needle neck with their head at the top, and just willowy and creepy and terrifying, and they sort of hide in all the shadows. It's just so unsettling. They're so terrifying. And she realizes that she's being haunted by her sister and sort of simultaneously feels relief and comfort to not be alone and to have her sister back, but is also terrified because her sister is now a hungry ghost, might not really be herself anymore, and she might not be safe around her sister. And she eventually reveals to Harvey and Ife that she's seen her sister, and they're very adamant that they need to do all the proper things to get rid of the ghost, that she can't let her sister Delilah haunt her forever, and they try to help her with that. And through the course of that, they witness even more ghosts. They have some very terrifying moments. They also become this sort of Scooby-Doo trio of ghost hunters, and they have a lot of funny, heartwarming, sweet moments together. And I really grew attached to them as a trio. And then they're called to a crime scene where a police officer has been murdered. And they start to ask more questions and put together more clues, and they eventually learn that this police officer was following these cases and noticed this trend and tried to bring it to the higher-ups and was told to keep it quiet. And there's some sort of conspiracy going on, and as they try to expose it, they put themselves in the direct line of what they believe to be a serial killer. And Harvey is murdered, which broke my heart. I was so upset, and I did not expect it to happen. And then Cora and Ife try to escape and get into an accident, and Ife dies, which I also did not expect. And I was heartbroken again, and I was sobbing at this point because I couldn't believe that both Harvey and Ife were gone. Cora eventually goes to her aunt and asks for her help, and Cora is able to put together all the pieces and realize it's not a single serial killer, which would have been bad enough. It's many, many, many killers copycatting each other and feeding into it and encouraging each other like some sort of weird, disgusting club, and it's so much more horrific and really drives home, I think, those themes that Baker's getting at of this sort of mob mentality, mob violence that feeds into itself, and people who hype each other up and make each other more and more and more angry and find that scapegoat, find the target of their anger and encourage each other and bring out the worst in each other to escalate this violence. Just horrific. And we also learned that the ghost that was the first one that Cora saw isn't even her sister, which made it so much more terrifying. We realized that she was one of the first victims of what they thought to be the serial killer of these copycat murders, who was trying to get her to solve the mystery, solve the murders, find that pattern, expose that it's being hidden, that it's being covered up as ordered by, I believe, the mayor of New York City. When we finally get to the end and we have a moment to sort of breathe with Cora, and she's feeling heartbroken and devastated. She just made these two friends, sort of her first two real friends outside of her sister, and now they're both gone. And she's feeling all of that trauma and loss and pain and grief, but she's also starting to feel like maybe she can carve her own path and become her own person and figure out who she is and what she wants and decide for herself. So there's a little kernel of hope. And at the very end, it's implied that her sister's ghost maybe is still around and that she is able to still contact her or speak with her or connect to her on some level, which is terrifying, but also oddly comforting at the same time. And I don't know, I just felt so many feelings reading this. It's so upsetting. It made me so angry, like ancestral rage level of anger, but also made me feel so helpless and devastated and heartbroken, while, like I said, also having so many moments that were light and funny and heartwarming and sweet. And it just ran the gambit of emotions and was such an experience and so eerie and atmospheric and intense. And I feel like I'll never forget reading this, the experience of reading this, and also all of the images that it conjured in my brain, because they were vivid and intense and gory and horrifying and very creepy. And I did not have nightmares about the needle neck ghosts last night, but I would not be surprised if I do at some point, because they're creepy as hell. But yeah, I think that's it. I feel like I've rambled for so long. I've been talking for almost an hour. I don't know if any of that made sense. Like I said, I wrote almost no notes because I was just so deeply sucked in and immersed that I barely came up for air. So that's just all off the top of my head. I finished it last night, but that's it for spoilers. 5 stars for Bat Eater and Other Names for Cora Zeng. Please go read this book. It was so good. Wow. Family, belonging, identity, faith, friendship, loss, grief, racism, scapegoating, police corruption, government corruption, identity, coming of age, finding your own path and purpose, connection to your cultural identity. So much is going on here, and it was amazing. So well done. So that's the first book I finished, and I'm going to stop. I need to stop. I will talk about it forever. I'm just going to move on. So anyway, the other book I finished since we last spoke was Mayra by Nikki Gonzalez. I actually had this as an ARC from NetGalley, and I wasn't able to get to it before it expired. So I put it on hold from the library, just hoping that I would eventually get it and I'd be able to read it, and it came through. Perfect timing. Just kind of on a whim today, I decided to dive into it, and wow, what a ride. This book is so weird. It's so strange. I believe Mayra is their debut novel, and wow, impressive. It was great. It is a fever dream. It feels like a hallucination, kind of like Bat Eater and Other Names for Cora Zeng. It just felt like I started it and then I couldn't put it down until I was done. I was so sucked in. It was so immersive. This one was definitely more lyrical and flowing and strange and malleable and dreamlike and odd. And we're following Ingrid, who is a Cuban American, and she had this best friend as a teenager Mayra. And they had a very obsessive, complex, kind of toxic, kind of manipulative follower leader sort of dynamic as best friends, but there's also a huge amount of sapphic longing and unrequited love and confusion between platonic and romantic and sexual attraction. And I think Ingrid says at one point that she's intimately aware of the sensation of not knowing whether you want to be someone or be with them. I think she says at one point she sees a woman wearing a beautiful dress and she's about to ask her where she got it from, but she stops herself because she realizes it's not that she wants to wear the dress, it's that she wants to wear the woman's skin, which sounds terrifying, but I think I know what she means. It's a really interesting examination of friendship, but also the complexity of female friendship when there is attraction, whether, the women involved are fully aware of or acknowledging their queerness or not. There's just that extra layer of complexity there. I just found it fascinating. Their dynamic was so interesting. When they were young, Mayra was a really strong-willed, outgoing, sure of herself, passionate, sort of vivacious person, and Ingrid was a bit quieter and more self-conscious, and she kind of latched onto Mayra and followed her wherever she would lead, in part because she was in love with her, not just as a friend, but romantically. And then they separate for college and don't see each other for a long time. Their friendship kind of falls apart. And then Mayra calls her out of the blue, invites her for a long weekend at this vacation home nearby. And Ingrid decides to go because she can't say no to Mayra. She's never been able to say no. And she gets there and things are weird as fuck. At this house. This is not a normal vacation home, and things are not okay. Turns out that Mayra's not there alone. She's there with her boyfriend Benji, and he's the perfect host in the weirdest, most creepiest way possible. And things just devolve from there. It's such an interesting examination of friendship and female desire, memory and identity, and things just become so wibbly wobbly, and the house itself is exceedingly strange, and time seems to melt away, and you never really know what's happening because the characters also don't know what's happening. This is very much a story where the house is its own character in the novel, where the horror is a house that isn't quite right, that doesn't seem to make sense. It's a labyrinth of a house. It goes on forever. It's confusing and strange and defies understanding, but also feels incredibly insular and claustrophobic, and there's this trapped feeling the whole time you're reading it. It grows so gradually, the tension is built so expertly, and you almost don't notice at first how tense and close and small and elusive the timeline and these characters have become. And I almost didn't notice the way that things had just vacuumed into this one time and place as if nothing else existed until we were deep into it. It just suddenly hits you at one point that the timeline is very muddy and people seem to be forgetting things and things seem to be changing in ways that don't make sense, and you're not sure whether Ingrid's perceptions are being affected somehow or whether the house itself or the situation is wonky, but it is very surreal and dreamlike. You feel like you're trapped in a nightmare where nothing quite makes sense. Everything is sort of close to reality, but definitely still in the uncanny valley. There's just so many layers to this. It is very fluid and amorphous and just strange. And I loved that. I love strange books. I thought it was lyrical. I thought the writing was beautiful. I loved the sapphic yearning, the unrequited romantic and sexual love, perhaps, but also a deep platonic love, the obsession and devotion to another person, the yearning to be seen and loved and recognized, what you're willing to sacrifice to stay loyal to your best friend or to the person you're in love with, finding a place where you feel totally accepted and loved and seen, finding your home where you belong, what that means, and what you're willing to give up for that belonging and acceptance and peace. It's just such a fascinating book, quite a quick read, very, very strange, very surreal and claustrophobic and hypnotic. It has a gothic feel to it as well. So interesting. This was fantastic. 5 stars for Mayra. Wow. What a weird little book. And I was really intrigued by Ingrid as protagonist. Loved following her story. Such an interesting, layered, complex, flawed human being. And Mayra, too, was such an interesting character, and their dynamic was painfully relatable to me in some ways, and great. So much crackling tension between them, both because they have this sort of, at times, adversarial former best friendship vibe going on, but there's also that sort of attraction, and they're not crossing the line, but there's so much sexual tension. Just really well done. So much pining and desire. It feels to me like a metaphor for losing yourself in a relationship, in a friendship, whether it be platonic or romantic or a mix, just losing track of yourself and your own needs and your own identity in another person, and not wanting to find yourself because that might mean losing the person that's become so important to you. And I just felt like it was such a great nightmarish representation of that feeling, and it was so visceral and intense and immersive and engrossing, and I loved it a lot. And I'm giving it 5 stars, like I already said. I would highly recommend this. I thought it was great. I can't wait to read more from Nikki Gonzalez. I just feel like if I started on a spoiler section, I would ramble on for 3 hours, and I'm not sure anyone needs that. Just go read this book. If it sounds up your alley, if you like weird, amorphous, dreamlike, fever dream books that are exploring female desire and sexuality, complex friendships, belonging, identity, books where the house is wrong and scary, I give you Mayra by Nikki Gonzalez. But anyway, I'm gonna stop now. 2 5-star reads. I'm really happy about both of these. I'm glad I picked them up. They're very different in style and tone, and I was gonna say content and subject matter. Subject matter, thematically, they have some overlap, I would say, but still 2 very different books. But again, 2 amazing 5-star experiences. Just incredible. Highly recommend both Bat Eater and Other Names for Cora Zeng and Mayra. And now I'm gonna go off and read possibly the final book for this video. I'm really teetering back and forth between Pet Sematary and The Good House. I think what I might end up doing is trying the first chapter of each of them and just seeing how I feel and going from there. And maybe I'll end up reading both if somehow I manage to be able to warp time to my whim and have enough time to do that, because I really want to. We'll see. Either way, I'll be back tomorrow on Halloween for my final update for this reading vlog and to wrap everything up. But anyway, that's it for me for now. I've been talking for way too long. I hope you enjoyed my excited rambling about these 2 5-star reads, and I'll be back tomorrow. I'm back for the final update of this video. It is the night of Halloween. Trick-or-treaters have come and gone, and I'm here to share my final review and wrap up this video. Happy Halloween to you, even though you'll be watching this video a little bit after Halloween. I hope you had a safe and fun and lovely night. Let me know what you dressed up as, if you dressed up, or what you did with your evening. I spent my evening reading the last book for this video and being interrupted every 2.5 seconds by kids ringing my doorbell, demanding candy, which is a great way to spend Halloween, I think. But I'm here to reveal the book I ended up finishing for this video. This wasn't less a decision of which one drew me in more or which one I was most excited to read, because honestly, based on reading the first chapter, well, the prologue in the first chapter of The Good House and the first chapter of Pet Sematary, they were both speaking to me in the same way. I was really intrigued by both. As soon as I finished those first chapters, I wanted to just keep going. And I'm not surprised, because I have experience with Tananarive and with Stephen King, and I am a fan of both of their work. So I kind of expected that. But that did make it hard to narrow it down and decide which one to read. I ended up choosing the one I did pretty much solely because I had a physical copy and it would allow me to take another book off my physical TBR, which is an ongoing challenge that I'm working on. So based on that, you've probably guessed correctly that I chose to read and finish Pet Sematary. That's not to say that I'm not going to read The Good House by Tananarive. I do want to read it. I plan on continuing to read it. Hopefully I'll finish it in the first couple days of November. But for this specific video, the fact that I had a physical copy was just that little bit of an extra push to choose this one so I could move it from my TBR bookshelf over to my finished bookshelves. And I'm not mad at it. This is going to be a hard book to review without spoilers. I think I'm going to spend more time in the spoiler section than the non-spoiler section for this book, despite the fact that this came out over 40 years ago, and probably a lot of you know what happens in this book already or have seen one of the film adaptations. I just feel like this book is much better experienced with no prior knowledge of what you're getting, and I had very little prior knowledge somehow. Magically. I truly don't know how I managed to be so unspoiled for this story, but I was, and that made it so much more intense, scarier, more heartbreaking, a roller coaster of emotions. And I want you to have that experience too, if you've somehow managed not to be spoiled. So I'm gonna try to talk about my feelings in very cagey ways, and then I will do a spoiler review of Pet Sematary by Stephen King. Also, I realized in my last update that I forgot to mention this. I had started 7 Empty Houses, which is a collection of short stories. As part of this video, my understanding was that this was literary horror, but I read the first 3 short stories in the collection of 7, and none of them felt even remotely close to horror to me. Some of them had sort of odd, well, they were all odd, but there were odd elements. There were sometimes slightly unsettling elements to the stories, but they fell much more solidly into literary fiction in my mind, and also sort of just weird lit, which I love, but I was starting to feel like it didn't quite fit the theme of this video, and I just wasn't as drawn in as I hoped to be. I felt like I kept finishing the stories and just feeling a little blah about them, having some theories about what the author was trying to get at with the stories, but just feeling like they were too short and too vague in most cases to really spark a lot of thoughtful reflection or to really stick with me. So who knows, I might pick this up again in the future and finish the stories. I'm almost halfway through, but I just wasn't quite feeling it. So I decided to DNF this for now, and also to not include it in this video, but I wanted to mention it because I was planning on reading it for this video and had started it. Anyway, let's talk about Pet Sematary. So I did kind of want to start by making note of, acknowledging the fact that this is a book that was published in the 80s, and it definitely feels outdated in a number of ways. There's use of outdated language, there's sexism, there's racism and racist tropes, especially the Indian burial grounds horror trope that sort of associates Indigenous people with a lot of negative stereotypes and uses those to incite fear in the intended white audience, usually written by a white author. And there's a lot of issues with that on many different levels. Personally, I could have done without it, and I think the story could have been just as effective, if not more, without that element. I think there are lots of other ways that the story could have done essentially the same things without bringing Indigenous people into it whatsoever, especially because this wasn't a story about Indigenous people. There were a few moments where it felt like King was trying to acknowledge the irony of using this trope and sort of playing on the fact that all of the US and Canada, all of North America, is essentially an Indigenous burial ground because of colonization. And there are a few moments here and there where characters point out that the land belonged to Indigenous peoples and eventually should and probably will return to Indigenous ownership, despite the fact that it's currently populated, owned by white people in this predominantly white town. Does that mean that the trope was necessary? No, I don't think it was. Like I said, I think this book would have been even more effective without that, but it is what it is. Take that how you will. There is also the incorporation of an Indigenous supernatural element, a supernatural being or creature from Indigenous lore and culture. I have heard of this specific supernatural element through mostly Métis stories from a Canadian perspective. Again, more incorporation of Indigenous peoples and culture without actually including Indigenous people in the story and without the story being about Indigenous people. And again, I don't think that that specific supernatural element had to be part of the story for it to work. Moving on to the actual plot and characters and themes and my experience of the story, again, trying to be as vague as possible to not spoil anything for you. I found this to be a deeply heartbreaking story, which is not necessarily what I expected going into it. Though I will say that the more I read Stephen King's work, the more I find that for me personally, where I feel he does best, or at least where I connect to his work most, is when he is being as vulnerable and human as possible, and when he's exploring really grounded human fears and horror. And I felt like that's what he was doing here. This really felt like the core of what I personally feel Stephen King does best. Yes, there are some supernatural elements, but I truly feel that the scariest parts of this book are the most realistic and human parts of it. And those parts are oftentimes more sad and heartbreaking and devastating than they are scary necessarily. But there is a terror to that level of devastation, to that level of heartbreak and despair. I think because Stephen King himself has said that this is the scariest book he's ever written, or the book that scared him the most, the book that he felt went too far, that he originally did not plan to publish, people go into this with very high expectations for scares. And I think depending on what you personally find scary and how you define terror, you're going to have a very different experience of this book and whether you think it actually is scary. I personally find, as I've said many times on my channel before, that the more grounded, more human, more realistic fears and terrors are more scary to me than the supernatural, than, I don't know, vampires and werewolves. I find the realistic horrors much more terrifying. And so for me, this book was quite scary, even if it wasn't rife with jump scares, though there were a couple that I would say are close to jump scare territory. And there are definitely moments, especially once you get to the very end at that really intense climax, there are definitely sort of traditionally horror scary moments, I would say, but maybe not as scary as other books, depending again on your perspective and what you personally find scary. If you, like me, are afraid of books that examine real grounded human fears, this might do it for you. I also think that this book is going to be a lot scarier for older readers, and specifically readers who have kids. I don't personally have kids, but I am in my 30s and I'm now an aunt with a toddler nephew, and I just know for a fact that this hit a lot harder for me in the current stage of my life, with many friends who are having kids and with my own sibling having a child, than it would have if I'd read it even 2 years ago, let alone 5, 10 years ago. I think if you're reading this at 20, it might not be as scary as if you're reading it at 35 and you have a 5-year-old at home. you know? Obviously, again, it's going to depend on each individual and what they like and what they don't and what they look for in horror, but so much of this is tied to the experience of being a parent and the inherent fears therein. And despite not being a parent, I am an adult who feels very loving and protective of a tiny human, and that makes this hit home on a whole different level. I also think having a spouse, having a very long-term life partner is going to make this hit differently. If I had read this before I'd met my husband, I might not have been as deeply impacted by it as I am today reading this, having been with my husband for over a decade. Just, I think where you are in your life, it's gonna vary, and I personally wouldn't recommend this book for parents, especially, and especially parents of young children. I just think this might be a lot for you. Again, you know yourself best. It's hard for me to really warn you without spoilers, but I, for example, would not recommend this to my sister, who is the parent of a toddler, to read until her kid is a lot older, if not, maybe never. But like I said, this is really a book that's examining what it is to be human and what our greatest fears are as humans, our fear of death, our fear of loss, the overwhelming, all-encompassing, devastating helplessness that is grief and how that can unravel us. This is really a story of loss and how that can tear us apart. And for me personally, in this current season of my life, that's a very relevant idea to explore. Those themes are mirroring what I'm going through in my own life. And so I found it deeply relatable and relevant and poignant. So much of what King wrote here felt like it was pulling thoughts and feelings directly from my brain and heart in a way that made me feel very seen, but it was also devastating to go through that with someone else, to experience that loss again. I think I found it cathartic in a way and a little healing in a strange way, but again, I'm not sure I would recommend this to someone who is fresh in grief. I'm about 5 months out from losing my dad, so I don't think I would have been able to read this in the first couple months, but it was still quite difficult to read at this point in my grieving journey. So for a lot of us, for a lot of human beings, the scariest thing to contemplate is death, whether it's our own death or the death of the people we love most, that we depend on most. And this book not only examines that fear, but also takes it even further by asking, what if sometimes dead is better? And what can actually be worse than the loss and the death of the people we love most? And this book goes there, which is part of why Stephen King said this is the darkest book he's ever written. I was deeply impacted by this. I was so engrossed. Like I said, I read the first chapter of this and The Good House. Both of them really drew me in. I needed to keep reading. I decided to read this one because I had the physical copy, and once I'd read another 2 or 3 chapters, I was completely hooked, and I read it until I could not keep my eyes open anymore last night, and then as soon as I woke up, I kept reading it. I just couldn't put it down, and from an early point in the novel, Stephen King is starting to not even foreshadow, but just literally tell you, if not exactly what's coming, hinting pretty heavily at what's to come and letting you know that bad things are coming. And so from an early point in the novel, you start to feel more and more tense. You start to kind of look over your shoulder and wonder how things are going to fall apart, what's going to happen, who is it going to be, how is it going to come about, is it this moment, is it going to be this moment? Every time the phone rings in the narrative, you as the reader are wondering if it's bad news. And it just really creates this claustrophobic, intense tension and dread that only builds through the rest of the novel. And it's funny because sometimes when I finish a novel, especially one that really sort of bowls me over, sometimes I find it useful to sit with it for a bit and kind of see how I feel, but then also to just quickly read 2 to 3 1-star reviews and 5-star reviews to see what people are saying and how I react to them, because sometimes that helps me sort of recenter myself and figure out where I land on that scale. And it was really funny to me reading a couple 1-star reviews because I just couldn't disagree more with everything they were saying. And I saw multiple people saying either it's not scary at all, they didn't get the hype, or that it was so slow and boring and nothing was happening. And I just, again, could not disagree more. So much is happening, but it's very internal. It is the stress, it is the tension, and a lot of what's happening is internal for you as the reader because you know more about what's to come than the characters do in the moment, in the life they're living, because we're being let into that through the third person omniscient narration. And you start to feel dread. You start to worry for the characters. You know, this is a horror novel that Stephen King said was the scariest thing he's ever written. So you know bad things are coming and you're just waiting for this idyllic family to lose everything, and you don't know how or when or why, but you are the one playing out that tension and the dread. And I love that. And I thought it was very effective. I just had the tightest feeling in my chest, almost like when I wake up sometimes. Ironically, there's a scene in the book where our protagonist Lewis wakes up and the family cat Church is lying on his chest. That's the feeling I had, and it happens to me all the time with my cat Yoda, who loves to lie on top of me when I sleep, and especially in the last couple years for some reason has been creeping closer and closer to my face. Gotten to the point where I sometimes wake up and her face is like 2 centimeters away from my face and all of her weight is on my chest, and it's very hard to breathe because she's not a small cat. That's the feeling I had this whole book, was just my not so tiny cat's entire weight on my chest. And also a pit in my stomach that kept getting bigger and heavier, and this roiling, unsettling fear for these characters. And I think the reason I felt so intensely was because I was so connected to these characters. The character work was amazing. We really get to know our protagonist Lewis, but also his wife Rachel and their 2 kids, Ellie and Gage. Even their cat Church, I got really attached to. I mean, I'm already predisposed to get attached to cats in books because I have cats in real life and I love them, but I was so invested in them, in their relationships, in their family. I wanted things to work out for them. And the fact that I was pretty darn certain that things were not going to work out for them made me very stressed. And the more that I got to know them and the more I got to like them and care about them, the more stressed I became. I thought the slow, steady pacing was great. I thought the doling out of information in little snippets was fantastic. It really created that creeping dread, the growing tension, that eeriness, the unsettling, uncanny feeling that increases every time something strange happens, every time Lewis learns more about the area he lives in and his neighbor reveals more information to him. It just gets more and more and more and more and more intense until finally at the end it just explodes. It was so well done. I also, like I said, found this really relatable in terms of its depiction of grief. I thought it was very realistic and sincere and heartfelt. That is really what I have come to appreciate most about Stephen King, is his stories and his novels where he allows himself to be very vulnerable about the experience of grief and loss and that loneliness, the devastation, the despair, the helplessness. I was highlighting and tabbing so many of those sections, just feeling so seen, and I cried multiple times because it was just so real and raw and visceral and heartbreaking. All that being said, I did also think this was pretty spooky. There are definitely moments that are leaning more into what I would say are traditionally scary horror moments, both, like I said, sort of moments that are jump scare adjacent, but also moments of, wandering through creepy places at night and weird sounds and thinking you see something out of the corner of your eye and thinking you locked the door and closed the window, but somehow they're unlatched and something has gotten inside. I think a lot of those more traditional horror scares are here, and maybe they're done in a more naturalistic, realistic way at times to serve the larger narrative. But for me, again, I find that more effective generally, and I find that scarier because I can imagine it happening to me in real life, unlike some of the more extreme, surreal, supernatural scares that other horror books employ more liberally. Another complaint I saw in the 1-star reviews that made me laugh, that I thought I would try to address in a non-spoiler way, is people being upset that the parents didn't do the bare minimum to prevent some of the bad things from happening. And while, yes, I agree, very frustrating, and I think it's addressed in the book where the characters themselves are upset at themselves for not doing the bare minimum, I do think it's realistic because a lot of us are unwilling to acknowledge that bad things can happen to us and our loved ones, and are sometimes unwilling to do the most basic, relatively simple things to take care of ourselves and our families and our animal companions, to take care of our health or our safety, or do just basic preventative measures or planning to stop bad things from happening, because it just doesn't feel like that could happen to us, or we don't want to contemplate it for even a moment. I think that's a very common human foible. And as much as it is frustrating to read in this book, and other times when that comes up, I just think it's very real. And so it doesn't bother me that much, to be honest. I'm going to leave it there for the non-spoiler review. I feel like you probably have an inkling of how I'm going to rate this, but I'll leave you hanging till after the spoiler section. So use the chapters down below to skip to the end of the spoilers to hear my rating, and I'll wrap up this video for you. But for now, let's chat spoilers for Pet Sematary, spoilers for the whole book. So if you haven't read this and you ever plan to, skip the spoiler section, use the chapters to do so in the description box. Here we go. Spoilers for Pet Sematary. Just for those of you, if there are any of you who are watching this video who never ever read horror, never plan to, and are watching all the way through and all the spoilers just because you're curious, I do this for horror TV and movies, so I can relate, because I can't really handle watching horror content, even though I can read it. So for those of you who are never going to read Pet Sematary but want to know what happens, basically the horror here is that this family has moved to a new town, and the neighbor across the street has shown them the local pet cemetery that is technically on their land or adjacent to their land, and has also warned them that the road that they live on is essentially a highway and that it kills a lot of local animals. It's very dangerous. There's a lot of trucks that go by, and just to be careful. And their family cat, Church, gets hit by a car and dies one night. And this neighbor brings our protagonist, Lewis, the dad of the family, along with him to bury the cat. He thinks to the pet cemetery, but then brings him past the pet cemetery to this other burial ground and tells him how to bury the cat there. And the next day in the afternoon, the cat Church, who was dead, shows up at the house again and is now not dead, but is different and strange, sort of walking in a lurching manner, still had blood on his fur, and doesn't seem quite right, doesn't seem quite the same. And Lewis is very unsettled by this for obvious reasons, but decides not to question it too much and not to tell his family, especially his daughter Ellie, who is the most attached to this cat, and they continue on and try to live their life with their slightly strange resurrected cat. And then one day their 2-year-old son Gabe gets hit by a truck on this highway and dies. And as you might expect, this is a huge blow for the entire family. They're all grieving intensely, and Lewis can't help but think about this second graveyard and the chance to potentially bring back his son. And you can kind of see where we're going with this. He sends his family away, and he digs up his son, and he brings him to this burial ground, and his son comes back, and Gabe is not the same little boy. And people die. He murders their neighbor, he murders his mother, and then Lewis has to end it. And yes, it is very disturbing and upsetting, as you could imagine. I think most profound, the most impactful piece of this book is the fact that it hinges so much on this desperation, on this feeling of a parent, but also just this human need to bring back the person you loved, to not be able to accept the death of someone you loved, to be in that denial phase, but to be so distraught, to feel so lost without this person that you love so deeply that you feel like you can't go on without them. And so you have to, if you had any chance to bring them back, you would. And I think what's scary about this is that in reading it, you can relate to Lewis and you can relate to his choices, because who among us wouldn't take that chance, even if we only had a 0.00001% chance that it would work, that we would get our loved one back? Who among us wouldn't try, because we love the people in our lives so much and we don't want to live without them? And I felt that so strongly reading this. Even as a reader sort of yelling at him, knowing it's going to go badly, wishing that he wouldn't do it, trying to tell him not to do it, knowing it's going to make everything worse, and yet completely and utterly understanding how he feels that if he doesn't take this chance, he's essentially killing his child, that he's killing his child again, or that it is his fault that his child is dead because he knows that there is this chance and he's not taking it, no matter how tiny the chance is that his son will come back at all, let alone come back as himself. And it's just devastating. It's so devastating to read, especially because I'm still, as much as I'm 5 months out from losing my dad, I still wake up so many days and just can't accept that it's real and that he's gone. It doesn't feel real, and I don't know how to go on without him, and how this world can keep spinning, how the sun can keep rising and setting every day if he's not here. And I can relate to Lewis slowly unraveling with the knowledge that there is this option for him, that he has this potentially magic pill to cheat death. And how could he not use it? You know, it's such a horrible situation to be in, and it's so intense and so emotionally fraught. And I just felt so much for him in that moment, because again, how could you not take that chance? As horrific as it seems, I think a lot of people would do what Lewis did, because we're human, and humans are fallible, and humans need other humans, and we need the people we love, and we are so bad at dealing with and accepting and processing and moving on from grief, and it's so hard. I'll also say that there is a moment where we go through, I think, a few chapters after Gabe has died, and I was just devastated. I'd cried a couple times. We get to the point where we're at the funeral, and I'm just feeling so devastated. Rachel and Lewis are completely unraveling. Ellie is so quietly devastating in her grief for her little brother. It's just so hard to read. And then Stephen King starts a new chapter and tells us none of that happened. All of this was in a moment in Lewis's mind as he was jumping to catch his son. In the moment before his fingers reached his son's coat, he imagined this entire thing, and then he grabbed his son's coat and he pulled him back, and they both fell and hurt themselves and were bleeding and crying and upset. And the truck zoomed by, but Gabe was alive. And then we get this chapter of Gabe growing up and having a life and going to the Olympics. And I should have known as I was reading it, because I thought, wow, this is going really fast all of a sudden. And Gabe is having such a great life. And how is the rest of the book going to play out if this is going so quickly? I'm surprised by this, but I was so relieved that Gabe was okay. And I wanted it to be true so much that I wasn't expecting the second fake out at the end of that chapter that reveals that Lewis was just dreaming this happy ending version of events, and that the first version of events where he just missed catching Gabe and he got hit by that truck really happened, and Gabe is dead, and the first version of the story is the story, and this was just a dream that Lewis was having, and it broke my heart all over again. I couldn't believe I fell for it. But I could, because again, it's the human condition, the foibles of being human, and just wanting to believe that it's okay, wanting to believe that this couldn't happen to a happy little bubbly, bouncy 2-year-old boy, even though I know that it happens every day, and also it's fiction, so anything can happen, but also it happens every day, and it can happen to anyone. It does happen to innocent little toddlers. Oh my God, I'm gonna lose it. Anyway, King got me twice, and I was very upset, and I wrote out all my feelings in my marginalia, basically just told him to fuck off multiple times, because I was very upset by the multiple fake outs and the way they toyed with my emotions. From that point forward, I knew that Lewis was going to bring Gage back. I think it was pretty clearly telegraphed by everything that had happened up to that point that that was going to happen. And my immediate fear became that Gage was going to come back and he was going to hurt or kill both his sister and his mother, and that Lewis was going to have to kill Gage and then live with his mistake having destroyed his entire family instead of just losing his son. And I was not looking forward to that moment. And while it didn't play out quite that way, because Ellie was out of town and was not involved, and luckily, at least as far as we know by the end of the novel, is going to be okay, although we don't know for sure that she will stay okay based on the way that the novel ends, it was still so hard to read the scene of Gage killing the neighbor Judd and then killing his mother, especially her seeing him and being so excited, so relieved, and calling his name and opening her arms to him, and that being the moment where this thing that used to be her son takes advantage of her joy and relief and overwhelming need to have her son back and lack of caution in the moment to kill her. And it was just so hard to read. And then for Lewis to come across them and to find them, the tension of that scene of going from room to room and realizing what was to come, it was just so much. What I didn't expect, though, was for Lewis to essentially completely lose touch with reality and decide that something went wrong with Gage because it had been too long before he was brought back, but that it could be different with his wife, and taking her right back and falling into that cycle one more time, that he just couldn't accept everything that had happened. And every time he's bringing back his cat and then his son and then his wife, it's just this slippery slope. It gets worse and worse every time, and he can't accept it. He can't stop the cycle. He keeps hoping that somehow he can fix it, that somehow it will get better. And it's like the worst version of the sunk cost fallacy to have ever existed. And just, again, so human and so relatable in a horrifying, horrific way. I think I said in the non-spoiler section, but I'll say again now, that I think that this would have been even more effective without any supernatural element, without the implication that this is the Wendigo, the spirit of the Wendigo, that is sort of influencing people and drawing them back again and again. I think it would mean more and hit harder, and that's kind of more how I'm interpreting it, that he's sort of, or the story that's being passed down, or there's maybe an implication that it could be the Wendigo, but that really it is just the human inability to accept the loss of a loved one and the desperation to fix it somehow, and that being the driving force to return again and again, even when it's horrifying and makes everything worse repeatedly, that they just can't let go of that chance, rather than it being a supernatural being that's, exerting its influence on people to constantly come back. I just felt this was such an effective portrayal of the visceral horror, the powerlessness of grief and loss burrowing into you, and your desperation and helplessness slowly unraveling you as it grows until you either lose touch with your sanity or just lose yourself entirely. And what's more terrifying than that? It just makes me think of in the first few weeks and few months after losing my dad, that I was sobbing in my husband's arms, just repeating over and over again, I don't know how to live without him. And that feeling that you don't know who you are without that person, and you don't know how to exist without them. And I think the level that I felt that losing a parent, I can't imagine how much more amplified that would be losing a child. And I just think it brings it to a whole other level. And it was so well done. It was so intense, and it was so terrifying and devastating and heartbreaking. And I think I'm going to stop talking about it because I keep making myself cry. So those are spoilers for Pet Sematary. There's probably more I could say, but I feel like I've been talking for a while, and I'm getting emotional. So anyway, as you might be able to tell, despite having a couple little qualms here and there, especially about the supernatural elements that I feel didn't really add that much to the story, this is now my favorite full-length Stephen King novel that I've read. I have not read that much of his work yet. There's still so much to explore when it comes to his work. He's, as you know, very prolific, but this was just very impactful for me, very intense, very emotional, terrifying on a really deep human level, and made me feel very seen in its depiction of grief and loss in many moments, and was terrifyingly relatable and just so disturbing and upsetting. And for me, it was a 5-star experience. I would recommend it with the caveats that I already gave. I know for some people this is sort of a slog and not scary at all, and it doesn't impact them, but if you're anything like me, this might be a really intense experience, and I can't imagine I'm ever gonna forget this and these characters and the scenes in this book and how vividly I saw them as I was reading and the way this book made me feel. What an experience. Wow. I feel speechless, which is ironic because I just talked for, I think, at least an hour, but I just, you know, at some point, what do you say? Nothing, because you just stop because you're done. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna stop. 5 stars for Pet Sematary. Great way to end this video. And that's it for this horror reading vlog. Those are all the horror novels I managed to finish in October. I think we did seven books, only 2 books that I own physically that I finished, which is a little sad. I still have quite a large pile of horror novels that I didn't get to. But let me know if you want me to do a part 2 to this or just more horror reading vlogs in general. I have been doing these every spooky season for the last couple years, and obviously I read horror kind of throughout the year, here and there, whenever I'm drawn to it, but I have so many horror novels on my list, both physical books that I own, but also so many ebooks and audiobooks that I have already purchased or have from my library that I'm really curious about. So I'm kind of tempted to continue on in this vein and read a lot more horror, at least for the next few weeks, as I'm still kind of in the spooky mood. So let me know if you'd want another reading vlog, just continuing on with horror, but wow, what an experience. I like to rank all of my reads at the end of a reading vlog, but because I only have 2 of these physically, it's kind of hard visually to show you. I will do it with book covers instead, because that will make it easier for you to see what I'm talking about. So Pet Sematary is going to be my number 1. It impacted me emotionally the most, but Bat Eater and Other Names for Cora Zeng is right there underneath it. It was also a fantastic 5-star read. Mayra is coming in right under Bat Eater, just a little bit less emotionally impactful, I would say, than the other 2, although still a fantastic 5-star read, as I already said. Then we get into the 4-star reads. So We Used to Live Here and Nestlings were my 2 4-star reads. I think, oh, that's kind of hard. I think I'm gonna put We Used to Live Here next and then Nestlings. Yeah, I think so. I'm second guessing myself. And then Graveyard Shift, my 3-star read. And then The Staircase in the Woods, my 2-star read at the bottom. Yeah, so Staircase in the Woods, Graveyard Shift, Nestlings, We Used to Live Here, Mayra, Bat Eater and Other Names for Cora Zeng, and then Pet Sematary is my ranking. I think so. Okay, that's it for this reading vlog. I hope you enjoyed it. Happy Halloween. It's actually technically not Halloween anymore because it's after midnight, but I hope you had fun watching this reading vlog and hanging out with me reading some horror. Let me know if you want me to do more horror reading vlogs in the near future. I have not had any nightmares yet connected to any of the books that I've read this month, but I'm a little worried I might have one tonight. So wish me luck. Hopefully I can sleep through the night. Anyway, I'm gonna go. This is probably such a long video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Give it a like if you did, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the bell so you're notified when I post new videos. And that's it from me. I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.